From Madrid, very, very welcome to our listeners. I am Manuel Alabart, Secretary General of the Spanish foreign policy think tank INCIPE. Please allow me just a few words in Spanish. Muy bienvenidos a nuestros oyentes del INCIPE para esta segunda conferencia de nuestro ciclo sobre la OTAN. En esta ocasión nos va a hablar el embajador Tacan Ildem, destacadísimo diplomático turco, hoy director general del think tank turco de Economía y Política Exterior, EDAM, y lo va a hacer en inglés desde Estambul. Let me introduce today to present his views on NATO, our speaker, the very distinguished Turkish diplomat, Ambassador Tacan Ildem, currently the chairman in Istanbul of EDAM, a think tank focused on Turkey's foreign policy, security, economic, and digital policy. Ambassador Ildem has an extensive experience in international and security affairs. Besides being Turkish ambassador to the Netherlands between 2003 and 2006, he has played an important role in Turkish foreign policy, as he has been in Ankara, foreign policy advisor to the president, director general of international security affairs, and head of the NATO military affairs department. On the other hand, Ambassador Ildem has been Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy of NATO in Brussels and member of NATO's 2030 Experts Group. Finally, he has been, for 5 years, Turkey's permanent representative at the OSCE in Vienna. With these very impressive credentials, Ambassador Ildem is certainly a most credible interpreter of NATO's role in today's very, very dramatic circumstances, and ahead of NATO's next summit, which, as you all know, is due to take place here in Madrid on June 29 and 30. I will now give the floor to our Director General, Mr. Vicente Garrido, who will briefly remind our listeners on how this talk is going to proceed. But before that, let me thank wholeheartedly Ambassador Ildem for his presence here today. It is truly an honor for INCIPE. To you now, Professor Garrido.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Manuel. And also, thank you. I'm very welcome to Ambassador Tacan Ildem. Well, the procedure today is the same as usually, but the single thing that today this event will entirely be developed in English. You can pose your questions through the send your question through the YouTube chat, or you can also use the hashtag Grandes Potencias OTAN in Twitter. Then at the end of the intervention of Ambassador Ildem, I will pick up the question and group these in depending on the issues, and what I suggest is just having an introduction for no more than 25 minutes, and then we will have 30 minutes left for questions. I should also remember you, please don't wait until the very last moment, until the last 10 to 5 minutes to pose your questions, because otherwise we will not have time for collect all. Thank you, Ambassador Ildem. The floor is yours now.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak before such an audience organized by INCIPE. And I would like to express my thanks and appreciation to the kind words of Ambassador Alabart and you, Mr. Garrido. It's a pleasure to be among friends to discuss an important topic of focus for all of us. As Ambassador Alabart has already said, we have an important event, upcoming event, which will take place in June of this year in Madrid, to the summit meeting of NATO. And one important issue on the agenda is the new strategic concept. Of course, we will discuss some aspects of it, but as has been alluded to during the introductory remarks, we have a major crisis in hand that also relates to the reflection process of NATO as to how NATO should strengthen its capacities in different ways for the evolving security environment with different threats and challenges. Well, let me first start with the necessity why we need to update NATO's strategic concept. We all know that, like all international and regional organizations, NATO also needs to adapt itself to new circumstances, the evolving security environment, since the environment is not static, and NATO needs to make an assessment of the upcoming period and what it could entail, and adapt itself accordingly. In fact, in its more than 70 years of history, NATO has been successful enough to adapt itself to new circumstances with different phases, waves of adaptation. When we look at the current strategic concept, it dates back to 2010. It was at Lisbon summit meeting that the current strategic concept was adopted, and right now it is the valid one. But we have to recognize the fact that there has been so many changes that the strategic concept requires an update. So far, it has served the purpose of all allies, but we need to make sure that all the decisions which have already been taken, especially since 2014, a watershed year, and I will come to that, but the main policy document, strategic concept, should also reflect those decisions and also gives a strategic vision and guidance for the future. Now, starting the basis of the work for the strategic concept, I have to make a reference to NATO 2030 reflection process. And in 2018, at London Leaders Meeting, heads of government asked the Secretary General to prepare his proposals for NATO's role in 2030 and beyond, by strengthening its political role. Let us not forget that December 2009 was the time when some leaders came with different views and say about NATO, including the notion of brain death insofar as NATO is concerned. So Secretary General formed an independent experts group from 10 members, women and 5 men. And since about gender equality, I should also take this opportunity to remind all of us of today's importance, International Women's Day. And no doubt NATO is one organization making an important contribution to women, peace, and security with gender equality and empowerment of women in all of its work. So when we discussed for almost 9 months what could be the challenges and threats in the future, no doubt, and it is maybe unfortunate, that we came up with the findings that Russia and terrorism will remain to be two main threats that would involve NATO in different areas of work. Now, the ongoing crisis in Ukraine proved us correct. Unfortunately, what Russia has done was not something in line with international law, but also with all the instruments that Russia was a party to. As you know, in 1975, the Helsinki Final Act, in 1990, the Paris Charter, in 1999, Istanbul Security Charter, and in 2010, Astana Charter. These are the documents Russia was a party to. And the fundamental principles enshrined in these documents clearly stipulated that all should respect to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of other countries, not use force or threat of use of force, respect the inviolability of recognized borders, and also respect the rights of countries to choose whichever security arrangement they wish to have with their sovereign decisions. And what we have seen on 20th of February, Mr. Putin, in a rather televised show, conveying his reading of history, was very peculiar, that with the pretext that he created, he was not recognizing all these fundamental principles. His history reading is not new to us, because in 2005, he in fact declared that the fall of the Soviet Union was the catastrophe of the century. And last year in July, he published an article. It was some sort of a manifesto, 5,000 words, giving his interpretation of history, saying that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine is with one single political identity and unity. And this year in February, 20th of February, in his speech, what was also alarming was that he was recognizing the sovereignty of all former Soviet Union states except Ukraine. So what we can deduce from his statements and the policies implemented is clear that in its near abroad, this is the term Russian, the sovereignty, the exercise of sovereignty for those countries in the near abroad is upon the approval and consent of Russia. Of course, this creates a notion of categories of sovereignty. One group of countries that can exercise sovereignty fully fledged, but the others with the consent and approval of Russia, which is something we cannot condone with. Now, in 2014, Russia illegally and illegitimately annexed Crimea and also launched policies, and they were aggressive policies to destabilize the eastern part of Ukraine, Donbas region. They also embarked upon hybrid warfare, which we have traced not only in Crimea during the annexation process, but also in the Donbas region. The small green man notion came out of the Russian activities in different parts of Ukraine. I said it was a watershed year because NATO, since 2014, with a number of decisions, could make it possible for NATO to transform itself militarily by its deterrence and defense. And when we met the Secretary General for the first time as the expert group, he emphasized 3 points. And one of them was to keep NATO strong militarily, with all the decisions that have already taken, but also with a new measures to be adopted in the short and medium term to keep NATO fit for purpose. Now, of course, Russia is a major threat. And since 2014, what NATO has adopted is a dual-track approach towards Russia. On the one hand, to strengthen deterrence and defense, and on the other hand, to have periodical and meaningful dialogue, political dialogue with Russia. And we have an instrument for that, and it used to serve purpose, NATO-Russia Council. Now, again, when we go back to the past, we remember Russian leader Putin in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, talking about his discontent regarding the enlargement of NATO. And he emphasized that it was not compatible with the security requirements of Russia. But this could be something he was not comfortable with. But one thing I have to emphasize is that although he was right now questioning the sovereignty of certain countries, he was the one in 2002 when he came to Rome to attend the NATO summit meeting in Practica di Mare, a small town close to Rome. There was a decision made to establish NATO-Russia Council. And NATO-Russia Council's establishment was based on NATO-Russia Founding Act, which was signed in 1997. So it was Putin himself who agreed with those principles that now he is challenging. So Russia is one important threat for NATO now and in the foreseeable future. Now, on the ongoing hostilities in Ukraine and Turkey, my country, qualified it as a war, and I will come why we have done so. We, as political analysts, were trying to understand the armada that he lined up on the borders of Ukraine. In our internal discussions in our think tank, I was asking our analysts not to pronounce the word war prior to any operation to be launched, because warmongering is something, as a diplomat, I would never prefer using. But at the same time, we tried to provide analysis based on the positioning of this very strong army on the borders of Ukraine, but also those in Belarus under the pretext of an exercise. And our predictions are, I'm afraid, happening nowadays, because although there is one war, there are two fronts. One is in the north, the other one is in the south. The southern front is moving perhaps in a more successful way from the point of view of Russia. The idea is, of course, on the one hand, to have the control of the two oblasts, Donetsk and Lugansk, since until lately, 2/3 of these oblasts were controlled by the Ukrainian authorities. And right now they are expanding their control. And Mariupol, which is a very key port city on the coast of Black Sea, is under siege. And probably what they aim is to have a corridor from Mariupol, from Donetsk, Lugansk to Crimea, and also to enlarge their operation to Odessa, to make sure that Ukraine does not have any link to Black Sea and become a landlocked state. I hope this will not happen, but things on the ground suggest us that it is moving that direction. For Turkey, the declaration or assessing the situation and naming it as a war is important, because we are the custodian of the Montreal Convention, which governs the passage of ships, be they commercial ones or war vessels, through the straits. And when we determined the situation to be a war, then we started to implement Article 19 of the Montreal Convention, which does not allow the warring parties to pass their vessels through the straits. Only those vessels who are registered in one of the port cities in Black Sea could be able to return to their ports, but those in the Black Sea cannot go out of the Black Sea. And Turkey will continue to abide by the letter and spirit of this very critical convention, which is part of international law. And I think it is also a guarantee to provide a degree of stability for the Black Sea and for Turkey. Two countries, Ukraine and Russia, are neighbors through the Black Sea. And that's why the good relations that we enjoy with both countries, our foreign minister has invited Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Kuleba, the foreign ministers of two countries, to come and join him in the diplomacy forum. It is an annual gathering, and they accepted the invitation. And let us hope that this engagement could provide a useful outcome. Now, a few points. In addition to Russia, of course, we have to look to other threats and challenges. I mentioned terrorism, and all forms and manifestations of terrorism is a direct and asymmetric threat to individual allied nations. And we made a number of proposals in that sense. China has not been mentioned in the current strategic concept. Although China does not pose a direct military threat to NATO, it is a growing and rising power in the global affairs. And in the systemic competition environment that we are in, we need to make an assessment of what China stands for. So we should look at China from a prism of both challenges and opportunities. And there are a number of areas where we could engage with China to make their engagement an opportunity for NATO. I should also mention that in our time, unfortunately, with the use of hybrid tactics, which includes cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns, the line between war and peace, or peacetime or conflict, is no longer clear. The line has been blurred. And this requires NATO countries, in accordance with Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, to strengthen their societal resilience. And the word resilience has become very fashionable after the pandemic, because with the pandemic, one thing was clear, that our societies should be able to cope with different challenges posed out of such global threats. Now, the Secretary General also asked us, while bringing some proposals to make NATO more politically strong, at the same time for NATO to adopt a more global approach. To adopt a global approach does not mean that NATO would become a world police. Not at all. NATO will remain to be a regional organization. Nevertheless, the threats and challenges we face are of global nature. Take, for instance, climate change, hybrid, cyber attacks. Even from far distant locations, NATO or allied countries could be exposed to such threats. That's why our vision should be more broader, to be cognizant of these global challenges, and to take measures to respond to these challenges. And climate change is something also that NATO could make its contribution, not as an organization by making norms, because it is the United Nations. But apart from that, NATO can make its contribution by reducing its carbon footprint, since NATO is in different geographies with its forces, and it generates carbon footprint, but with the use of technologies, we can reduce it. One last word, then I will stop here, since I follow the time, and time allotted to me has almost come to an end. It is emerging and disruptive technologies, which can be a game changer in the future. Nowadays, innovation is in the heart of all NATO activities. There's an innovation board functioning at NATO headquarters. The idea is, on the one hand, to maintain interoperability among allied nations, but at the same time to keep the technological edge, especially in a systemic competition that the present security environment imposes upon us. And this requires more cooperation among allies regarding sharing of technology, especially military technology. And with all the challenges that we face, not a single organization can deal with them. And this requires partnering with individual countries which are not NATO allies, like Asia Pacific partners, or partners like Sweden and Finland, but also with other international organizations like the European Union. So NATO-EU cooperation is not a choice, but a necessity in the coming years ahead of us. So I stop here in order to have your questions. I hope that this could kick off a discussion ahead of us.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have for sure received a lot of questions through the YouTube chat and through Twitter. Well, the first one of the participants asked, and in this reflection, as a permanent debate of Western policy in Europe has been the hot issue of NATO's enlargement towards the east, always closer and closer to Russia's border. What is Turkey's position on enlargement? This would be the first question. And should NATO consider going ahead with full membership for new members, for instance, with Finland or Ukraine, or other alternatives would be appropriate as we move towards NATO summit in Madrid?
Well, first of all, let us recall that the founding document of NATO, which is Washington Treaty of 1949, in its Article 10, talks about enlargement. As long as any European nation aspires to join NATO and embraces the fundamental principles enshrined in the document, and could be able to contribute to collective security, then they could apply for membership, but it is up to the existing members to take a decision by consensus in order that aspiring country join in the ranks of other NATO nations. Insofar as Turkey is concerned, Turkey has been a staunch advocate of enlargement. We think that enlargement contributes to enlargement of security. And we have been supportive of the aspirations of all countries, including those of Ukraine and Georgia. Now, you would ask me whether Ukraine and Georgia are ready to join, and my answer would be no. When we look at the criteria and the performances of these countries, they are still behind the requirement. So in a foreseeable future, it would not happen. So I don't think that this is a question that would involve the leaders in Madrid summit meeting. And I don't think that to accept the argument of Russia would be fair and correct, because if Russia agreed on the fundamental principle enshrined in all the documents that I alluded to in my introductory remark, then it should be respectful to the choices of individual sovereign countries in which security arrangement they would wish to take part. And let us not forget, it was all former Warsaw Pact countries that quickly applied to become NATO members. If it was so attractive to remain in the ranks of Soviet Union cluster together with Russia, then they wouldn't have done so. And Russia should also pose the question why it never became a sort of point of attraction. Attraction was in the West, and probably to make sure that their security is guaranteed. Vis-a-vis whom, I leave it to your discretion. But it was not out of the force of NATO for them to apply. It was their free choice. And I can give you one example. For instance, NATO has partner countries, Austria, Switzerland, Serbia in Western Balkans. and they don't want to become a member of NATO, and NATO respects that. Serbia will never become a NATO member, and we respect that. So enlargement is something we should never give up. It is up to those nations who are fit to join, and at the same time with capabilities to contribute to the security of NATO allies.
Ambassador, the second question is related to Turkey's foreign policy. Turkey has balanced its NATO's commitments with your close ties with Moscow, but Turkey has recently termed Russia's invasion of Ukraine as war and has refused right of passage for Russian warships going through the Bosphorus. That is, ships sailing from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Could Turkey do this on a permanent basis? Does this represent a shift of foreign policy, Turkey's foreign policy towards Russia?
Well, first of all, Turkey is a NATO country and faithful with its commitments to NATO. That's why Turkey has been contributing to the collective defense of the alliance, and also takes part in almost all operations and missions by sending troops, sending important capabilities, aircraft, naval ships, etc. So having good relations with Russia does not conflict with our commitments to NATO. For instance, many people criticize Turkey when we engaged in a dialogue with Russia on Syria. Well, for Turkey, and Spain is one country that could understand this better than other allied nations, it is an existential threat of terrorism. And we see that in Syria, due to the lack of control by the central regime, due to the civil war, there are terrorist groups based in Syria inflicting damage to Turkey through their attacks to Turkey. And Turkey initiated several cross-border operations to Syria. And in Syria, there are Russian forces. Russia is Turkey's Black Sea neighbor, but Russia, unfortunately, it is a reality of life, is also our neighbor to the south, since they have presence, military presence in the south. And it is more than normal for Turkey to engage in a dialogue with Russia, at least to deconflict the forces on the ground in Syria. This was done between the United States and Russia when United States had forces in Syria. So why not Turkey does it in Syria, given the fact that its forces are together there with Russia, or Russian forces. Now, going back to Montreal Convention, Turkey is only implementing the convention. So it is not to take any sides. You decide that it is a war, and it is a war when you look at what's happening in Ukraine, then after determining the situation to be a war, you automatically, as the custodian of the convention, implement Article 19 of the convention, which is talking about a situation when two literal states are in war. So what Turkey does is strictly to implement the letter and spirit of the convention. So it does not require any further judgment except determining the situation to be a war. And we have informed all countries, including Russia, that we would be implementing Article 19. And for instance, there were 4 warships going back to Black Sea, and 3 of them were not registered in any port in Black Sea. So Russia could not pass these 3 ships to Black Sea. And let us say, in these days, if Russia wants to pass some of its ships to support its operations in Syria and pass it from Black Sea to Mediterranean, it would not be possible, because according to Article 19, it is not possible. So it is not siding with any country, but implementing in a bipartisan, neutral manner the convention for the purposes of all.
Ambassador, regarding China's role in the currently in the conflict with Russia, we seem to need desperately an effective mediator between Russia and Ukraine. China could be one, but they haven't done the job, at least for the moment. Over the last weekend, President Erdogan has volunteered to be a mediator. How could you rate China's chances or Turkey's chances to stop this war? And what kind of compromise do you think would be acceptable for Russia and Ukraine?
Well, the second part of the question is the most difficult one, and one can speculate on a number of options and contingencies, but I'm not going to dwell upon them. What I heard today, and I need to check the real content of it, but I heard that President Zelensky was expressing his readiness to discuss Crimea and Donbas regions. I don't know what he meant. We need to examine the statement properly before jumping to any conclusion. Regarding the role of China, everybody was focused, and it was quite natural, on the joint statement issued after Putin's visit on the margins of the Winter Olympics between the leaders of Russia and China, and it talked about the enlargement of NATO, that it was not acceptable for both countries, and was portrayed as if it was a solid evidence that China would be siding with Russia. But in the following weeks, what we have noticed is that China, in UN votings, for instance, abstained. And the Chinese leader also reached out to the Ukrainian president, expressing the respect to sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine, which was something important, and also that the conflict should be resolved through diplomatic means. I don't think that China would 100% support Russia, because it would be detrimental for its own interests. China would prefer to see multilateralism function. It doesn't want its commercial, economic transactions and ties hampered with the Western world, and not only Western world, with the majority of the countries in different geographies. So we need to make a distinction with the approaches of Russia and China in that respect. But of course, China also has certain priority areas like Taiwan, and we should be watchful what it could do. But at this stage, China has not shown any interest in mediating. I don't know whether in the long run it would be something in the cards or not. Turkey, being in the region and regional ownership is something Turkey has always advocated when it came to Black Sea. And Turkey thought that it would be an important contribution, being a regional country, to reach out to the two countries that it enjoys good relations, to mediate to the extent possible. And that's why the recent initiative of President Erdogan and the two countries, Foreign Minister Lavrov and Kubela, will be in Antalya at the Diplomacy Forum, and they will be at a trilateral meeting together with Minister Çavuşoğlu of Turkey to discuss different aspects of the conflict. I don't know what the outcome would be, but at least Turkey will continue its best to facilitate talks between the two warring sides.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have now one of the so-called 1 million question, which is related to Taiwan. Do you think, Mr. Ambassador, that NATO's response towards the current Ukrainian crisis could restrain China from launching in the near future an attack against Taiwan?
I hope so. Although what we have seen from the recent high-level statements coming from Beijing is that they are making a distinction between Taiwan and Ukraine. For them, Ukraine is a sovereign, independent country, whereas Taiwan, according to their perception and interpretation, is part of China. So when you hear such comments, these are not encouraging, of course, and let us hope that they wouldn't draw wrong conclusions out of the ongoing crisis to take an adventurous step, but rather restrain themselves in keeping the things as it has been so far. So I agree with you. It's a $1 million question, and I can't speculate further.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We have a couple of questions about the future of the NATO southern flank, and especially in the Mediterranean. And Eastern Europe has moved into focus again. Will NATO be able to show its presence and especially defend the interests of the Mediterranean countries, for instance, Spain, regarding concerns on migration from Africa?
Well, in fact, in the report that we as independent experts group presented to the Secretary General, and it was discussed by foreign and defense ministers, and also triggered a discussion at the leaders level, have a separate chapter on South. If we talk about NATO's 360-degree approach, we should not only focus on threats and challenges emanating from the East, which is Russia, but also from the South. And be it terrorism or proliferation of weapons of mass destruction or migration, organized crimes, these are very important issues to tackle, and we should not lose our focus and make sure that enough attention is given to those challenges emanating from the South. That's why Hub for the South in Naples was created. And I'm sure that the capacities of NATO will be strengthened in the future, not only to have a better situational awareness regarding what's happening in the southern neighborhood domain, but also with the necessary capabilities in place, be they in the ensurement of freedom of navigation in the critical sea lanes of communication in the South, in the Mediterranean, but also addressing some of the challenges in the form of uncontrolled migration movement. Therefore, my answer is yes, NATO should sharpen its focus and capabilities for those threats and challenges from the South. And our report clearly gives very important and concrete proposals in that respect.
Thank you again, Ambassador. Regarding the future of the strategic concept of NATO's strategic concept, and especially can this new security situation modify the agenda of the Atlantic Council in Madrid? If so, in what sense? After Ukrainian war, the future strategic concept, core tasks should be maintained, maybe is another reflection of one of our participants, but prioritizing then privileging collective defense, and furthermore, with respect to security environment, should conventional warfare be faced as the main threat, conditioning capabilities and training?
Well, first of all, the current strategic concept, which dates back to 2010, is still a solid base for NATO to operate. So you refer to three core tasks. Indeed, collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security will remain as core tasks of the alliance. And right now, we see how important it is to have collective defense as one of the core tasks, but also the crisis management with all the measures that are in place to put things under control in different geographies, and third, cooperative security with a web of partners in different parts of the world. Take, for instance, Sweden and Finland. They are two important partners, and they were included in the consultations that NATO foreign ministers recently had in assessing the situation in Ukraine. Now, my opinion is that resilience will also feature prominently in any discussion while adopting the strategic concept. And in the new updated strategic concept, resilience will be an important element. I don't think that the agenda of Madrid summit meeting will change, because strategic concept with all its core tasks of the alliance are there. And if we talk about collective defense, this is relevant given the circumstances that we were faced because of the ongoing war in Ukraine. My only expectation and hope is that since the European Union will be adopting its strategic compass, another important document, at the end of this month, any idea emerging out of this strategic concept would not contradict with those of the strategic concept. Since both organizations talk about complementarity, strategic compass and strategic concept should also complement each other, reinforce each other for better synergies in addressing those complex challenges that both organizations face in line with the niche capabilities that they have. Perhaps I may take this opportunity to allude to my views regarding EU-NATO cooperation. As I said, this is essential. But we have heard so many times strategic autonomy of the European Union. And we know that France is one country pushing it so hard. And one could only anticipate that French rotating presidency of the European Union, while adopting the strategic compass, would wish to see the ideas of strategic autonomy more than other member countries. But I think the situation, unfolding crisis in Ukraine will not give the possibility for those who advocate strategic autonomy, especially the Eastern members of the European Union, would still be looking at the United States and its guarantees and would not let strategic compass to be with a sort of a solid statement on strategic autonomy. When we talk about strategic autonomy, as long as it reinforces NATO cohesion, it's fine. As long as NATO will continue to be considered as the cornerstone of European security, it's fine. As long as the European Union creates more capabilities of its own, it's fine, because it adds to the capacity of Europeans to have a fair share in NATO defense spending. And one remarkable thing is to note the recent decision of Germany to increase the defense spending to 2% level with an amount of 100 billion euros. It is something to note. And one last thing regarding NATO-EU cooperation is the necessity to fully involve non-EU allies in the European Union's security and defense initiatives like PESCO and European Defense Fund.
Thank you, Ambassador. Two last questions. One of the more sensitive one is related with energy security. And one of our participants from the very beginning asked, there are some prospects in order to develop a common strategy regarding energy security inside NATO, or should this issue be still in the hands of the allies? Should there be a decision linked with the national policies?
Well, energy security has always been part of the consultations within NATO, and we, in our report, in ensuring that NATO becomes a more political or politically stronger, because we are talking about not a military alliance, but a politico-military alliance. We also propose that NATO should be more used as an essential and unique transatlantic forum of consultations. And energy security is one particular area that NATO countries could elevate their consultations. Take, for instance, what Germany has come up with. The decision to suspend the Nord Stream 2 project is a major development. And I don't think that it came out of the blue, but it is also related to close consultations among allies. And definitely it is a national as to how you manage your energy resources and what kind of arrangements that you can make. But the present crisis also indicate that a degree of consultations and coordination among like-minded countries, be they EU countries or NATO countries, would be necessary. So I definitely put energy security as one of the issues that NATO should keep in scope in its consultations. Another one would be arms control and disarmament, no doubt about it.
And the last one, Mr. Ambassador, is another 1 million question related with NATO's strategic choices in order to avoid future conflicts in Europe coming from Russia, for example, against Finland or Sweden. Sorry.
Well, we don't know yet what the sovereign decisions of Sweden and Finland. I know in 2014, after Russia invaded and annexed Crimea, the popular support of NATO membership increased enormously in Sweden. Finland has always been more conservative and more sort of restrained in its approach. But this time, after 20th of February and with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Finnish public opinion has shown that they are supporting NATO membership with almost close to 50% popular support. And this will be a critical question. Both nations would decide on their own, but I'm sure that if I know both countries' dynamics, not a single one of them would wish to lag behind or left alone. So there would be a coordination between the two countries involved. In any case, Finland and Sweden, as I said earlier, are close partners of NATO. They enjoy the highest level of political dialogue, and the practical cooperation between NATO and those two countries are so important. I know the political dialogue also to elevate the situational awareness and assessment capability of NATO when it comes to High North, Arctic region, Baltic Sea region, because these are countries in the region with enormous knowledge base and expertise. But to answer your question, strategic choices, whether these countries to be joining NATO or not, first and foremost, they have to make their own decision whether to apply for a membership or not. If they do, I don't think that the membership process would be long. It will be a swift one since they have all the criteria met and also the capacity to contribute to NATO's collective defense and security in Europe.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you especially for having submitted to this interrogation and for having responded brilliantly to all the questions asked. Thank you also to all the participants. And now, please, Ambassador Alavar, if you can take the floor for closing this session today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicente. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ildem, for such an important and clear talk about NATO and Turkey. Let me take you off two or three things you said. The need for NATO to improve our resilience. I think that's important. The need to have a more global approach. Without that mean abandoning the idea that NATO is a regional alliance. The need also for NATO to keep that 360 degrees approach, which means including the southern flank. You also, extremely interesting, your comments on the relationship between the strategic autonomy of Europe and that relationship with NATO, and the close link that we have to have between the two. I was also very interested about what you said about the warnings that Mr. Putin had been sending to the West, beginning with the 2017 intervention, 2007 Munich conference remarks, and then, of course, the invasion of Crimea in 2014. The fact, as you said, that for Mr. Putin, historical readings, or at least his historical readings, take precedence over international law, over international principles. That's very worrisome, I would say. I think that I would also talk about what you said about the Montreal Convention, which is perhaps a convention we were not that much familiar with, and Article 19 of the convention and Turkey's interpretation and putting into effect of this Montreal Convention. That I think is going to be important for our Spanish listeners. And finally, your reference to the Antalya talks that are going to take place in due time. I think we all cross our fingers that this effort by Turkish diplomacy in Antalya and will bear some fruit, and perhaps will, I don't know if it will stop the war, but at least it will be the beginning of the end of this terrible situation in which we are included. Just to end, let me remind our listeners that our next talk on this series about NATO will be on March 15. We will have Mr. Miguel Ángel Ballesteros. He's the National Security Advisor for the President of the Spanish government, and he will talk about the new Spanish security strategy. And then on March 24, we will have Carmen Romero. She's the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy in NATO in Brussels. Just a few words in Spanish. Pronto tendremos como continuación de este ciclo sobre la NATO a Miguel Ángel Ballesteros el 15 de marzo. Miguel Ángel Ballesteros es el director del Departamento de Seguridad de la Presidencia de Gobierno y nos hablará sobre la nueva estrategia española de seguridad. Y el 24 de marzo tendremos entre nosotros a Carmen Romero, vicesecretaria general de la OTAN para Diplomacia Pública, que nos seguirá comentando la postura de la NATO hoy, pero en este caso desde la propia Bruselas. Thank you very much again, Ambassador Ildem. It was a pleasure having you. Please consider INCIPE in Spain your home. We are at your disposal for whatever you might need of us. And for all our Spanish and international listeners, have a very good day. So long. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.